welcome to the lightning rounds. So the idea behind this session is we have 3 speakers who will each be giving a brief talk, and if you want to hear more about their topic, they will be presenting again in the afternoon later, so you can follow up with anyone in particular that you really want to hear about. So without much more ado, I want to have people come in, and we'll get started with our first speaker. And I just realized I have found my notes here. I'm like, whoa. So first today, where is it? Is going to be, let's see, Laura Sewell. Hi, Laura. I'm sorry about that. Laura is at Bates College, where I worked many years ago. Yes, we should connect. So now I have to find her bio here, and let me tell you a little bit about how wonderful she is. She is a lecturer in environmental studies, and she is the director of the Bates Morse Mountain Conservation Program in Phippsburg, Maine. Laura Sewell pioneered eco-psychology in the 1990s and taught eco-psychology at Prescott College for a decade. She holds a PhD in visual psychology from Brown University and is the author of Sight and Sensibility, the Eco-Psychology of Perception, and numerous articles and essays. Overall, her work has focused on our common and potential perception of the natural world and our consequent environmental actions. And she's currently working on a manuscript entitled Not Yet Seen. So thank you, Laura.
Pleased to be speaking to a group that is clearly knowledgeable and caring and active, and I will start now. So I'll be speaking about our waters, and in particular our coastal waters. And what I've learned while being the director at the Bates Morse Mountain Conservation Area in Phippsburg. The conservation area is a 600, more or less, 600-acre protected land of sand dunes, upland forests, and salt marshes. So one of the things, let me make sure I've got this right. One of the things that I've learned while working there is that salt marshes offer us a great suite of ecological services or ecosystem services, and you probably know this. We know that the salt marshes provide habitat for the young fish and support our fisheries, that they provide protection from storms, they filter out excess nutrients and protect us from, or the coastal waters, from algae blooms and pollutants. And the most important thing in my mind today is that they sequester and store large amounts of carbon. So, this is the Sprague Marsh at Bates Morse Mountain. It's about 74 acres of thick, abundant grasses and sedges and forbs and rushes that decompose into carbon-rich soils, making this a really significant carbon sink in a reservoir. Essentially, the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is converted into organic matter through photosynthesis, and particularly with these fast-growing plants, some of that organic matter becomes shoots and leaves, but a lot of it goes into the roots and the rhizomes, and we get this carbon-rich soil. And because the salt marshes are inundated twice daily by tides, the underlying sediments are saturated and they're largely anoxic, meaning that they're not exposed to oxygen, so they decompose very slowly, meaning that the carbon sits in place as organic matter, and we call this blue carbon. So blue carbon, it turns out, is a really big reservoir of carbon on the planet. The term was first used by the United Nations Environment Program in 2009, so it's a relatively new recognition about the importance or the significance of carbon sequestration and storage in these coastal systems. So these coastal systems are among the most productive on the planet, but beyond that, their carbon burial rate, the rapidity and the degree to which they bury carbon in these carbon-rich soils surpasses these other highly productive systems by an order of magnitude. So here you've got tropical forests, et cetera, in comparison to the salt marshes, the mangroves, and the seagrass bed. So you can see how really important these systems are for carbon storage. So, I missed something earlier. I wanted to tell you that a recent and I think very significant recognition of the ecosystem services, including carbon sequestration and storage, is an evaluation done by Robert Costanza and his crew. That came out to be $194,000 per hectare per year for salt marshes. That's magnificent, isn't it? So that means for a 74-acre salt marsh, which is the Sprague Marsh that I showed you, the annual value that's accumulating there is $5.8 million. I'd like to think of this as our collective wealth, and maybe as an indicator of a better indicator than GDP, as an indicator of our community well-being. So, the issue, though, is that salt marshes are threatened. So the past threats, we probably all know what were ditching, spraying, filling, and draining. The current threats to salt marshes are sea level rise. So here's the Sprague Marsh again on the seaward side. You can see a tremendous amount of erosion, greater storms, greater intensities, erosion on the front end, and green crabs, the explosion of green crabs due to the rapid warming in the Gulf of Maine. So this geological survey marker on the left, standing vertical on February 20th. This is March 5th. And of course, it's long gone now. This is happening very quickly on the seaward side. So this is an important threat. A third threat, so green crabs, sea level rise, and storm intensity. Third one are tidal restrictions, and that's really what I want to talk about. Tidal restrictions that limit the full tidal flow and the ability of the salt marshes to move upland with sea level rise. So, back to sea level rise as a threat. It's worth noting that higher waters, higher seas, also brings in more sediment. It's possible that the marshes can grow with the amount of sediment that comes in, but there's a tremendous question about whether or not it can keep up. Marshes can keep up with sea level rise. It turns out that it depends upon the nature of the particular system. So here's Bev Johnson, geology professor at Bates College, who is measuring the accretion rate in the Sprague Marsh. We don't know the answer about whether or not it can keep up with sea level rise without measuring every year for about 10 years. We're about 5 years into it. But we do know that the capacity of one of these systems to keep up with sea level rise and maintain the incredible functions that are provided by a healthy salt marsh is dependent upon the amount of sediment that is in the system already, whether there's a lot of sand and sediment in the system, and the tidal range. So back on the slide where there was the 20 to 90% loss, that is one of the estimates for the global loss. Did we already have that slide? I think we did. Yeah. So that estimation is a huge range, obviously. And it's a huge range because we don't know about these accretion rates. It depends upon the system. So we're trying to sort that out. So this system has a fair amount of sand, good tidal range. It could keep up. But there's another question. This is the question of whether or not the marshes can migrate upland as the sediment moves in and as the tide moves in. Is there this upland space, this accommodation space? Well, given the infrastructure and human decision making, it's hard to know whether or not there is that space, whether or not there will be that space. But we do know that sediment is not going to move upland, and the tide's not going to be able to move the marshes upland if we've got tidal restrictions. So this is the real concern that I have. These tidal restrictions cut off the sediment transport, cut off the full tidal flow. So this is an example from my neighborhood. The imbalance makes it clear that the full tidal flow can't get upstream. In these conditions, the salinity drops. Not only do we lose the full functioning, meaning carbon sequestration, but the salinity drops when the tide is restricted. That means methane is emitted. So we get a loss of carbon storage, we get methane emissions, and these degraded marshes become a net a net climate change contributor. So we could call this situation the tidal restriction. I don't like to think of it, but I think of it as climate dysregulation. This is a really big problem. So
what's limiting the tidal? What's the restriction on it?
the restriction is a culvert that is too small under the road crossing. That's what the restrictions are. And here's where they are. This is the coast of Maine. The Maine Coastal Program estimates that there are 1,109 of these tidal restrictions. 454 of those crossings, road crossings that are restricted, are in salt marshes. So just imagine if these restrictions were opened and water was allowed to go where it was meant to go, restoring those marshes to good, healthy function. That's what the Maine Coastal Program Coastwise Initiative aims to do. It's a new initiative that's designed to identify the steps needed for partners and community members to open the floodgates. To date, it lays out the importance of the work, the training that's needed, and the various tasks, roles, and jobs that need to be done. It begins with and it rests on good communication with landowners, municipalities, agencies, and funders. So what if we were to rapidly mobilize ourselves to work with the natural order, to open up the culverts and the dams and the crossings that restrict the flow of water into marshes? What if there were jobs that we're trained for, jobs up and down the coast were offered to take out these restrictions? What if these projects were part of Maine's contribution to the Green New Deal? This could be an example of local vesting. Thank you. So this one last piece. This also requires a flip in our worldviews, right? We're guided by the belief that we should keep the water out, right? Our fear is sea level rise. We think of building more walls. But what if instead we're committed to building resilience by enhancing the capacity of natural carbon sinks to do their work, to function well? This worldview reversal is not easy to hold in our minds because of the fear and uncertainty that surrounds this issue. So, as you heard, I'm a visual psychologist by training. I've thought about what determines our perceptions and our worldviews and therefore translates into our actions for about 30 years. And there are several fundamental determining factors. One is that we're receptive, good reception. Another one is that we become conscious of what we're attending to. This shapes neural networking in our worldviews, how we process information. And third is language. So my last statement, I'd like to make a plea that we empower ourselves and each other with intentional, progressive language, that we become mindful of how we speak, and in so doing we shape our worldviews, we shape the worldviews around us, that we normalize the language of the Green New Deal by defining and then doing specific actions like opening floodgates. So, let's see, is that what I do?
Uh-oh.
Anyway, we can do this and just take this off
Okay.
of here. Okay. I think, yeah, that's right.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. That was great. Great information. Up next is Ivan Fernandez, who's professor of soil science in the School of Forest Resources. Soil silence, yes, there we go. And the professor of, in the School of Forest Resources and School of Forest Resources, Climate Institute, and School of Food and Agriculture. Okay, yeah, it's all in the slides. So we'll just say also, though, that his research is currently focusing on biogeochemistry of ecosystems. I can't read from while I'm in front of a crowd, but welcome, Ivan Fernandez.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Any questions? No. So my name's Ivan Fernandez. I am a soil scientist. I've been a professor at the university for 35 years. I achieved that by paying attention to instructions, and Becky told me to talk about soils and forests, not just forestry as the label, and do it in 14 minutes. And so the good news is I'm actually a New Yorker that's been here a long time, so I might get close to 14 minutes. How many knew what the state soil was before I put this slide up? I'm so sad. So, good. So the state soil is Chesuncook. Oh, good. We've got a few. It took me 2 terms of the legislature in the 1990s to get it passed and signed into law by then Governor King. So please remember it. It's a beautiful forest soil. My charge here was to talk about forest soils and some practical aspects and thinking about solutions. And so that's what I'm going to focus on in the next few minutes. Although clicking that doesn't work. Clicking that works. So I don't have to say anything really to this group about that the times they are changing. Major features of the changing climate in Maine are it's getting wetter, it's getting warmer. A lot of people in the last 10 to 15 years that hadn't thought about climate change as anything but warming. All they think about now is the intense rains or the intensification of the hydrologic cycle, which really has had profound impacts on all the sectors, all sorts of ecosystems. I like to take the opportunity to also say that while the temperature's changing and the precipitation's changing, realize the chemical climate is changing. So carbon dioxide, as it goes up, all plants grow better. And nitrogen deposition was bad because it was acid rain, but it was free fertilizer. And all of the landscape out there is primarily nitrogen deficient, so we're getting less of an essential nutrient coming out of the sky, which forms both a pollutant as well as a nutrient. I put calcium there because as acid rain has declined, soil calcium, and particularly forest soils, is beginning to recover, which is an important part of that resilience of these ecosystems. So the point being, there's a lot of things changing on our chemical and physical climate, and they're changing now at rates that we've not seen before. And so we have a lot of challenges understanding that. And so that's the scientists saying things are really complicated. But this talk actually is trying to make them simple. We've already, Laura already introduced us to forest ecosystem services, and so when we think about our response to climate change, we're thinking about how ecosystems do all sorts of things, productivity and sustainability. I should read my slide this way. Carbon sequestration, which is, of course, a big one, water quality, clean air, wildlife, recreation, on and on. Just a spiritual meaning of forests and resources themselves. And there's another beautiful picture of a soil profile. So the big question in soils when we think about them is how do we respond? And there's a lot of ways to answer that and a lot of different time lengths I could take to answer that. But what really has become increasingly dominant in the narrative around soil ecosystem health and our response to climate change is soil health, which I'm going to talk very briefly here in a minute. A lot of these approaches span what I refer to as the climate response spectrum. And so everything Laura just talked about relative to salt marshes, it goes from mitigation and adaptation and everything in between. So mitigation is reducing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and adaptation is what we do about it, how we respond to it. It's opportunities, but it's also a lot of bad stuff, just for the reason that it's happening faster than we can keep up. We've got 7.5 billion people on the planet, and we're not very resilient, and we're doing this at a global scale. But some things really can address that full spectrum as management of salt marshes, ecosystems, and soils can. Threw this slide in there because if you're interested in climate adaptation actually across agriculture to forestry, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, has done a lot of work in climate adaptation. They have specific targeted workbooks that you can work through in order to evaluate your setting and your priorities and provide you resources and tools in order to how to address it, in order to figure out how to address it. So there's a lot of things we can do to use science in a smart way to respond to that system. This slide also allows me to say when we talk about forest soils, of course, there's a full range of forest soils. There's soil supporting extensive sort of commercial spruce fir flats in northern Maine. There's forests out back here. There's forests in your backyard. There's forests in between fields. So there's a lot of forest under a lot of trees. Maine's almost 90% forested, so we have a lot of forest soils in the state, and they're really important. I'm biased, but I think that's a justified statement. So in a changing climate, what do we do about forest soils? And I guess for the sake of this discussion and to provide kind of a practical framework that you'll remember, and then you can go dig into the details, I would strongly encourage two components. First is know your soils. And there's a lot of information out there about soils. This is very practical. If you go to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or if you go to Google and just Google soil, web soil survey, you're going to come to that screen, and does that mouse move? No. Oh, yeah. Or maybe it doesn't. That button, Start Web Soil Survey, if you press on it, you're going to go to a map, and you can find out where you are. You can delineate where you are, and then on that map, that's going to look something like that. You're going to see all sorts of little pieces of puzzles once you lay over at the soils map. And typically in this area, these are going to be second-order soil surveys. It doesn't mean that every square inch is exactly that soil, but they're going to be related. And within that resource, there's all sorts of information about the characteristics of these soils, how to manage them, what you can expect. If you're doing something very specific, you should go out and examine the soils specifically, but there's a lot of information at your fingertips to use in order to promote the resilience of your soil. And if you want to know where you are, you're right there. So that's the Hutchinson Center, and those are the soils that are around us out back. And if we went and looked up those little symbols, you'd be able to find out all sorts of information. What do you do with that information? Depending on your objectives and the conditions, of course, the specifics are quite varied. But there is an overarching theme that has emerged in the world of soil science that has to do with soil health. You may hear a little bit about it later. I hope I don't steal anything from Ellen for those that are in that session. But soil health, we've begun to talk a lot about that in natural climate solutions relative to climate change, certainly in agriculture and in forestry. What is it? Well, soil health is really thinking about soil systems. And for a long time in the natural sciences world, we talked about soil quality, which was to try and force us to think about, well, it's not just the little particles, but it's the chemicals and it's the biology that's in there. And so those, those components. Soil health really lives at the intersection of them, and it thinks about soils as an organism. It's not a spiritual statement. It's a system statement. And soils interact between the physical, chemical, and biological. Soils breathe. They respire, just like we do in the sense of if you went out and measured right now, they'd be exhaling CO2 and taking up oxygen because microbes and roots in the soil are respiring, just like we do. And so that has underpinned the notion of dealing with the soil as a living system, paying particular attention to the biology in order to build as much resilience as possible. And if you do that, you're going to sequester more carbon, you're going to be more responsive to all of the challenges of climate change, from drought to intense rains to erosion and what have you. How do you do that? There's really the sort of Cliff's Notes on soil health. There's big books, but this is the easy one. It's the ABCs of soil health. A, keep your soil covered at all times. Sort of obvious, but you never want your soil to look like that, because the next rainfall event, doesn't have to be too big, is going to take away your very best soil. And at the top of the soil is where we have the most carbon, it's the most productive, and so every little millimeter of that material is the very best that you're going to lose first. And so keep your soil covered at all times. And so that's a no-no. B, diversify plant cover. If this was an agricultural group, we'd be talking about conservation, tillage, and no-till. In a forestry group, we're talking about a variety of different settings. Certainly plantation forestry that you see over there with those pines. There are economic and social reasons why that takes place. That's not the debate, but that's really farming. That system's going to have the least resilience, the least carbon, and it's going to be the most vulnerable to the impacts that we see from climate stressors. This forest, besides it being a pretty picture, by the way, never give a talk and follow a visual specialist with beautiful slides, but that's another story. So this forest is more resilient, it has more biodiversity, it has more carbon. It's going to provide all those ecosystem services that we want from our forests, but particularly our soils. And then number 3, kind of obvious, but do not disturb. And so in Maine, we've got a lot of forest cover. And probably the very best conservation practice to preserve a forest soil is to leave the forest floor intact. It's a nice fibery, carbon-rich material. Water percolates into it fast so it doesn't run off, allows it time to soak into the mineral soil beneath it. That's the good news. The bad news is the step function to really messing up the system is pretty steep. So you go in and you disturb it, then all hell breaks loose, and you're going to get erosion, you're going to get carbon loss, increased respiration, and it's going to take decades to recover from sort of, that's one of many bad pictures I could show you, but that kind of mechanical disturbance. And so the last part is do not disturb, and that pretty well applies. If you think about that as you think about prescriptions either in an urban forest or a commercial forest or a small woodlot, wherever you are, they can be pretty good guiding principles, and then obviously you can dig in for the details. Okay, time's ticking. When you think about forest soils, it's not just soils that we moved under a tree. They're fundamentally different in important ways, and particularly so when we think about the climate stress on our systems. And so I like to say, it's a forest soil when, the comedian that uses that, but worms are bad and snow is good. And so why am I saying worms are bad and snow is good? Well, most of our forest soil, most of our acidic forest soils in the state essentially don't have earthworms. The glaciers came, scraped everything away, so all the earthworms are kind of invasive that we have in the state. But they don't like acid forest soils, and so if you go try and get your worms to go fishing up in a spruce fir flat, we won't see you for a long time because they're just not there. And those systems are adapted for that. If you introduce earthworms, that little cartoon is showing you what happens when you introduce earthworms into a forest that doesn't have earthworms. They chew up everything. They blow off the carbon, your biodiversity crashes, they eat the fine roots of the trees, and they dramatically change the resilience and the quality of that ecosystem. And from a climate standpoint, all the things we want ecosystems to do, they do a lot less. Someday it'll be a nice healthy forest again, but do we really want to wait 200 years because we threw our fishing bait out in the woods where we shouldn't have when we were done? So worms are bad in some contexts, and we have an issue with invasive worms showing up in places we don't expect them. I don't have time to go into a story about that, but we're one of the people that is working with me on a research project way out in the boonies in northern Maine. We didn't expect to find earthworms at all, but part of the stand was different, and he was wondering, why is that different? And he started to dig, and he found earthworms. And he had cell phone connection, so I learned about it in 13 seconds after he found them. Snow is good. So what's snow do for us? Lots of things, of course, but it insulates the soil. And just to cut to the chase, an example here of yellow cedar decline on the Alaskan Peninsula was being researched in the 2000s, trying to figure out what's going on with these coastal communities of a particular species that was experiencing a dieback. And the story about that was climate change was decreasing the amount of snow or the length of the snowpack into the spring. That means when it got cold, it froze the soil. Normally the soil would have been under a snowpack. When it froze the soil, it froze the roots. And that species was vulnerable to that. And so in coastal areas that are experiencing the most loss of snowpack, and so that's the 3 climate divisions in Maine from our report, Maine's Climate Future in 2015, just giving you a projection between now and 2050 of the loss of snow in the different zones. And we're in the zone, of course, that's going to lose a lot of snow because it's warmer here than it is up there. We're closer to 32, it warms a little, you lose snow. And so soils become more vulnerable. And then the last thing I'll show you that is just another version of what Laura already showed you. There's a lot of carbon in soils, and so let's not underestimate the importance of that pool. The first thing is do no harm, don't mess it up. If you disturb a system, you lose carbon. It respires faster, and you blow off a lot of the carbon. So we want to protect what we have. Forest ecosystems are in the box over on the left. And that's from the IPCC report, wetlands, which includes the systems that Laura just talked with you about, a huge amount of carbon in those systems. And so my message is twofold. Number one is there's more carbon below ground than above ground. We don't want to mess it up when we have it. We'd like to use a little bit of natural climate solutions by stuffing in more carbon into the soils or into the wetlands by what we do. But also, that's not an infinite process. And so we can add more carbon, but don't let anyone ever tell you that that's offsetting what we need to do with fossil fuels, because we need to eliminate fossil fuels. It's a short-term gap to get us through this century without doing the worst damage by managing to increase carbon in our soils and in our ecosystems. But the lion's share of the greenhouse gas problem is fossil fuels. And so this is important and it helps. But it does even more by building resilience in ecosystems to build soil health. And so with that, I'm done. Thank you.
So please welcome our next speaker, who, of course, is not in alphabetical order, making me look even more ridiculous. Okay, here she is. So Janis Petzel is a psychiatrist at Penn Bay Medical Center and an educator and columnist who focuses on the neuroscience of trauma and resilience in her clinical work. And she served as the president of the Maine Association of Psychiatric Physicians and has practiced in communities as far-flung as Barrow, Alaska, and Fort Kent, Maine. Yes, Fort Kent. And she's currently on staff at the Penn Bay Medical Center, writes a mental health column called Island Mine for the Islesboro Island News, and is an active member of the Physicians for Social Responsibility Maine's Climate Committee. So please welcome Janis Petzel.
Thank you. Is this
thing in the right place? Can you all hear me? No. No, okay. Maybe we'll just do the handheld thing. Sorry. All right, is that better? All right, now I just got to figure out how to get my slides up here.
Right here.
Is it up there? No. I have to give up and get my glasses, sorry. All right, well, thank you for that introduction. I am a psychiatrist. I specialize in adult psychiatry and geriatric psychiatry. My husband and I moved to Islesboro in 2013, and because I live on an island with ferry service, I can't really have a real job, oh, poor me. So I do what's called locum tenens, which is like per diem, and I was going to Fairbanks, Alaska from Maine, which I just realized was not an environmentally friendly way to practice, so mostly I do per diem at Penn Bay now. Physicians, whoops, let me go back. Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Maine chapter, focuses on climate change, nuclear safety, and toxics in everyday life products. Let's see, so in the year 2000, they came out with a groundbreaking report called Death by Degrees. And I know some of these slides are a little bit hard to take in a brief period of time, but I'll give you the website where you can get these at the end. Today we're going to focus mainly on 4 aspects of this because you just can't do the whole thing, but you can see any climate-related change that impacts health has ripples that move out into the larger world. So today we're going to focus on allergens and air pollution with the effect on respiratory illness, vector-borne disease, the impact of heat, and then I hope we can get into mental health. So the first is vector-borne disease. How many of you are from Maine? And how many of you know someone who has been diagnosed with Lyme disease? Yeah, we all do. So you can see from the bar graph that cases of Lyme disease in the past decade have gone up and stayed up. The problem with deer ticks, you probably all know this already, but there's probably 14 different species of tick in Maine, but the main one that has an effect on human health is the deer tick. So deer ticks are these little, I was going to say a nasty word, that actually their life cycle requires that they take a blood meal from 2 different rodents and a deer. We just kind of get in the way of that process. Deer ticks can carry more than Lyme disease. So if you get bit by a tick, you might get more than one illness. Right now, babesiosis, which is that red line, that's also called Nantucket fever, that's starting to go up. And is probably going to be more of a problem as time goes on. And then anaplasmosis is the blue line. That's a bacterial illness which can make you sicker than a dog. Flu-like symptoms sometimes requires hospitalization. So as you can see, from 2016 to 2017, that went up by almost 80%. So it's something to look forward to. Not. The other pest that we deal with here in Maine is the mosquito. Luckily right now, there are sporadic cases of viral illnesses that are carried by mosquitoes. But what we have to worry about is the Maine CDC projects that by mid-century here in Maine, we are going to have probably close to a month of days over 94 degrees with the heat index. And things, yeah, it's a lot of days. And the mosquitoes that carry really nasty things like dengue fever, chikungunya, Zika, those can possibly survive coming up here. They probably won't last through the winter, but they could possibly survive here through the summer. So, I mean, that's pretty terrifying. Heat itself is an impact on human health. The people who are most vulnerable are the people who are most vulnerable to everything, very small children and the elderly. You can see from this graph that when the heating days are higher, the trips to the emergency room end up higher. People have problem with heat exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration. We are just not set up for heat in Maine. We're not used to it. We don't have air conditioning in our houses. People live in very rural places. So even if your town sets up a cooling center in the summer, a lot of your friends and neighbors are not going to be able to get there. We have kids who are practicing sports outside. So the way of life is really going to change as things get hotter here. The people who are at risk for heat-related illnesses, as I said, older people and younger people. Older people who are more frail, as people get older, they lose their sensation of thirst, and they lose their sensation of heat. You've probably all seen your older relatives always feel cold, even in the summer. So people don't know that they're getting overheated or dehydrated until it's too late. And people with cardiovascular diseases, you can get hot enough and lose enough fluid that it's actually a cardiovascular stress, and your heart can actually, I mean, it can be fatal. The people who are on certain medications, people with HIV treatment, people on dialysis, and people on psychotropic meds like antipsychotic medications don't handle heat as well as other people either, so it's like they get piled on too. And as it gets warmer, and God forbid we lose the protections with our air quality that we have now, Maine is what's known as the tailpipe of the country, that very charming designation, where air pollution from the west moves east, and on hot, humid days in bright sunlight, just from chemistry, ozone levels go up, and ozone is a very potent trigger for asthma. You can end up with bronchospasms, you can end up with small airway disease, persistent cough, and even people who don't have asthma can look like they're getting an asthma attack. If a small child is getting a cold, it can push that upper respiratory infection into looking like asthma. Maine actually has one of the highest rates of asthma in adults and children in the country, and so if we don't change what's coming our way, that's just going to get worse. And then, I hate to keep saying the same thing, but adding on top of that, because most years spring has been coming earlier and fall comes later, you know, the killing frost comes later, so pollen counts are up. I don't know if I react badly to maple pollen, I don't know about you, but a lot of my friends have been really feeling under the weather because of pollen, so that's just everyday life misery. But for people with asthma, if you add in the ozone and the pollen, I mean, it's really a risk. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but mental health is a big topic, and probably the most obvious risk for mental health problems with mental health is from catastrophic weather. I volunteered down in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, so I saw firsthand what happens acutely, but not everyone who's exposed to this kind of thing gets PTSD or depression, but the people who do end up having long-term problems with it. There was a study out of Princeton that the people who developed PTSD and depression after the hurricanes still had it 2 years later. Suicide rates go up 10 to 30% after these disasters. But I think the really more subtle and draining problem we're having is with our young people who feel like, what future do they have? I was talking to one of our colleagues here over at this morning, and she was saying her son is feeling like, well, should I even bother to think about having a family? You know, I mean, that's a big, kind of under-recognized trauma, I think. My colleague Dick Thomas is going to talk more about this today at our workshop if you want to hear more about mental health. All right, this is a little bit more, are we done? I wanted to close with something that is actually a little bit more hopeful. In Maine, this isn't a health problem. This is like one of the things we can do to improve things here. But I think I'm preaching to the choir here with, we all know that beef and the way we grow beef in this country causes a lot of greenhouse gas production, and a lot of food waste contributes to a carbon footprint. But in Maine, I think we're a little bit ahead of the curve. We're getting lots of small farms, farm-to-table movement's big here. You can buy local, at least a good part of the year. So I think that's actually a hopeful thing. And we could talk all day about how to take action, but you're all here, and thank you very much for that. I will have handouts about a lot of this stuff at the workshop this afternoon, and have a good lunch.